Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back again to the Nightly Plant Plus Podcast. For all of you who are new here, this is your host, Deja Grant, along with our P3 co-hosts, Amauri Brown, Seth, Mrazik, Noah Steele, and you. Tonight, we'll be covering a topic that a lot of people have probably heard about, but don't take the time to discuss or research, and that topic is pesticides. Now, for those of you who don't already know, pesticides are chemicals or substances sprayed on crops and cultivated plants as a control mechanism for pests that may harm the plant or even harm the organisms that consume them.
Well, actually, that's a common misconception. Those are the most common form of pesticide. However, the term pesticide actually encompasses any substance that is used for killing plants, animals, or fungi. Although today, we will mainly be focusing on the insecticides that are sprayed on crops.
Thank you for the clarification, Seth. Pesticides and insecticides aren't just methods used in the United States, but worldwide. However, just because it's a global mechanism doesn't mean it's the safest. Sure, there are less pests bothering our foods, but have you all ever actually thought about the other side effects and risks that come with the utilization of these methods? If not, that's why we're talking about it tonight. Seth, would you like to elaborate more about that?
Sure. When crops are sprayed with pesticides, much of what is sprayed does land on the plants, but how about the rest? The substance that doesn't find its way to the plant travels into the air we all breathe. Well, some of it only lasts a short time frame. Some can last unmeasurable amounts of time. Now, on a small scale, this wouldn't be too bad, but we're talking about something that is used on a large scale in pretty much every country. Individuals who live farther away from agricultural areas are less likely to receive as much exposure, but those who live near farmland are receiving constant exposure. A lot of these chemicals are carcinogens, can trigger asthma and all other sorts of bad things. And that's just not right. Not to mention that we who don't live by agricultural land are still at risk of putting those pesticides in our bodies by consuming products that have been sprayed with them. The pesticides are absorbed by plants, and when we eat them, they are absorbed by our bodies. Our bodies naturally try to get rid of these chemicals by having our livers cleanse them out. For adults, this is a challenging process, so imagine how it is in the bodies of children and babies. They also tend to put their hands in their mouths more, touching on grass, weeds, fruit, and other pesticide-sprayed products, which puts them at a far greater risk of ingestion. They're also at high risk of absorbing these chemicals through their skin because they have less surface mass, and therefore more areas of their bodies can be reached.
Everything you guys said is completely true. Another con to using pesticides is they can have a major effect on the health of the plants, insects, and animals that are exposed to them. But they can also have a substantial environmental impact. In several cases, pesticides have been found on contaminated drinking water that comes from underground water. This contamination mostly occurs from runoff water entering streams and rivers. After heavy rains, water will carry the pesticide into streams and other sources of water. This has several major effects on ecosystem in which there is a high concentration of pesticides. According to an article in the Atlas of Ecosystem Services, in areas of high concentration of pesticides, biodiversity was greatly affected. In some areas, biodiversity dropped by 58%. Also, the quality of the water in these streams dropped. This process can be devastating to communities in underground areas that relies on freshwater sources for their drinking water. The best way to address this problem is to start to decrease the amount of pesticides used in agriculture and hopefully eliminate all use in the future. Instead of using harmful chemicals, farm owners should search for natural alternatives to control pests.
Another reason why we must stop using pesticides is that insects and weeds can develop resistance on certain types of chemicals. As a result, we must use more and more chemicals to control insects and weeds. This kind of situation is called pesticide treadmill. Therefore, overusing pesticides can only make things worse. Here are some alternative ways that might be useful for us to replace pesticides. First are swap plants. Some insects, if given a choice, they will feed on only one type of plant or another. Once the trap plant has become infested, the trap plants can be disposed of. A second method is companion planting. Some plants possess the natural ability to repel certain types of insects. For example, an herb called basil can be planted near tomatoes. It repels tomato hornworms. Lastly is pest-resistant crops or BT crops. They are genetically modified, so they are toxic to certain insects. With this method, plants can produce the proteins to protect themselves without external bacterial or synthetic pesticide sprays. These are very practical pest control strategies in the long term.
Well, you guys raised some good points. It is also important to remember all the good things that pesticides bring about. Pesticides include all chemicals that are used to destroy plants, animals, or fungi. Although there are some methods that are capable of dealing with these problems, without the use of pesticides, often they become necessary. Let's not forget the potato famine of Ireland in 1845 that caused the death of millions from famine after a fungal disease. These catastrophes are avoided today thanks to the help of pesticides. And although we have been using pesticides as a very broad term, it's really not that simple. There are a vast amount of different pesticides that are used in farming today, each of which have varying effects and varying uses. Even food that is labeled as organic is often grown using pesticides, just not man-made pesticides. Some of the natural pesticides can become more harmful than the man-made ones. Pesticides are becoming safer as scientists are figuring out what pesticides are harmful and which ones are more safe for consumption, as well as the environment around it. In the early 1940s, one of the most common pesticides was arsenic, and I need not remind you how poisonous arsenic can be. We are constantly coming up with new innovative ways to protect our crops, and I don't believe getting rid of pesticides is the answer yet. Without them, many crops would be lost, causing an increase in the cost of food, which could be very bad for the consumer. Pesticides help keep plants alive and keep them relatively cheap. Although they are not perfect, I would prefer to live in a world with pesticides as compared to one without them. All in all, I think it really just comes down to responsibly using pesticides along with other tactics. That way we can reap the benefits and the risks become lowered.